Okay, JavaScript. Okay, in terms of JavaScript working for you, there are two data types that you need to know for JavaScript. One, there are primitive data types, okay, and there are object data types. The thing you would need to know about that is that all of those are technically object type things, okay, but the data types that you're using that are like primitive data types are, they work a particular type of way, okay? The following are string, which we all know is using double quotes or single quotes, okay? Okay, also any character can exist inside of a string, okay? That is all a string. Okay, the second part is a number. Okay, and those are whole numbers. So we have 2, 1. Okay, those are all numbers in JavaScript. Okay, I think floats are separate things. Okay, a Boolean. Does everybody know Boolean is true, false? Oh. Okay, and then undefined is undefined. And no. Okay, those are all primitive data types. Okay, they're basically the building blocks to create programs. Okay, so these are all the pieces that you would need, that you have access to build something in JavaScript. Okay, the other data types that you would have access to are objects. Okay, so we kind of talked a little bit about this earlier. Objects are defined, or they're basically syntactically written out using curly braces. Okay, that would basically show that this is an object. JavaScript, it's typically this would look like an object literal, which means that like this is exactly one object. If you get further into JavaScript, you can see that there are other like objects that are like prototypes that allow you to say like this is a factory version of what this object should be, and then you can say like new thing. Okay, and then thing would have been defined earlier as a type of object, and then it would instantiate that object. But needless to say, when you see this in JavaScript, this is basically an object. It would include property type, a property thing, and value. Okay. So you're saying like this is like an attribute, and then this is the value of that attribute within the object. Okay. The other one we have is an array, which would look like this. Okay. An array is basically a collection of items. It could be an object, numbers, any primitive data types, but they're all going to be notated in this way. So you can have 3, you can have hello, you can have, and they're all going to be comma separated. You can even have an object in here. Okay. You can even have another array inside of an array, which is the nested array. Okay. Dates are date object types. So you can say date, and then there's functionality for dates that allow you to say like, 4, 3, 2017. Probably not exactly in this syntax, but basically you would be saying like, I want a date to be set at this point. The default to which it would set a date object at the time that is instantiated. Okay. Other objects that you would see in JavaScript are a regex, which we talked about, regular expression, and that is shown. And that looks like we had A through Z. Okay, so use those two forward characters. Okay, that's what a regex looks like, a regular expression. And that's basically for patterns. We're saying like this is a pattern that we're wanting to try and either find or test against or utilize. It becomes useful when we start to want to set things up or change things based on, like, the easiest one to think about is phone numbers, for example, right? Or email addresses, you know? So trying to find a pattern or set a pattern. Okay, and the last one is function syntax. We'll learn about like specifically ES6 syntax that might change the way you see what a function looks like, but functions are typically going to look like that, okay, where an argument would end up being set here, and then this is the block, statements going here, and that ends the block. Okay, so in this case, these curly braces are stating this is where the block, like the block starts, and logic is put inside of that block. Yes. And you can find all of this information, like all the data types. You can find the documentation in Mozilla. In the docs. Okay, so you can get all this technology information here. Mozilla developer framework, JavaScript. It's a really good place for documentation. Find all the data structure stuff in here. So it'll give you a lot of information about these are primitives, and then the values of those, and then it'll go into like what those things exist, like how those things exist, and all the different kinds of subsequent information that you need to know about JavaScript. Dates, collections, there are all the different types of arrays, etc., etc. Okay. Let's see, what else do we have to go through? Oh, okay. So we talked about data types. Let's talk about Booleans and operators. So there's operators that you can utilize to do some work. We've seen equals, we've seen equals equals, and then we've seen equals equals equals. We've also seen and two pipes. Okay? You can tell me what this one is going to do. It's setter, right? It's setting variables. This is going to set. Okay? This equal is going to compare two objects. Now in JavaScript, there's something called like inferred comparison. So this is basically going to, like if I have a 3 here and a 3 here, if I run that comparison, it's going to say true because it's going to coerce this to or it might be the other way around, but like it's basically going to coerce, like say like, well, this is a string and this is a number, but I can infer that if I see this object here as a 3, and then this is saying 3 as an integer, I can like try and coerce this to a string and see if it matches. I think it goes the other way around, right? Like if this is a 3,
like
and that's a string.
Our get method we use in our grandma, we're typing something in off of it becomes a string, right?
Yeah.
Compare it to a number.
So in JavaScript specifically, it's going to say, well, this is an integer and this is a string. Those are two different data types. But if I can coerce this string to be an integer, right? Int, I don't remember how the specific syntax. But if I can coerce this to be a number, then I can make that comparison and I can see that those are equal if they happen to be the same type. This one, if I do the same thing, 3 on the string 3, it's immediately going to check for those types and it's going to say it is not the same thing because it's inherently not the same data type. It's called type checking. Okay. And the other, yeah. Okay. Variable, we already talked about. In ES6, a variable, oh, let's go through the rest of this actually. We have and. So this is going to say if 3 and 3, if these are both things, right? Like if I'm happy and you're happy, we're both happy, right? Whereas this one is if I'm happy or if I'm happy or you're happy. Okay, so in this case, we're both making sure that both you and I are happy. Okay. Whereas in this case, I'm saying if you're happy or I'm happy, that's what this is, an or operator. Oh. Okay, so if you're happy and I'm not, then it's still true because one of us is happy. And if you're happy and I'm not, one of us is true, so it's still one of us is happy, so it'll still be true in this case. But in this case, both of us have to be happy or it's just not gonna work out. Make sense? Okay, so in some of your work that you did, hopefully you're utilizing some of this and or and making sure that you know what's happening. Okay. So there are some operations that we can utilize with integers, which again are whole numbers, not decimals. We can check if a given number is integer. Okay, so this is a function that allows us to double check whether or not a given number is an integer. So if we had like 3.5 dot, oh, like 3.5 dot is integer would not exist. Number is integer 3.5, that would not exist. That would be false. Okay. Okay. So we talked about strings having quotation marks. We can utilize different methods for each of these data types. There are a set of methods that we can utilize, or functions. Okay. We already kind of got into like uppercase is to uppercase or to lowercase, right? We can also utilize concatenation, like mathematical operations with strings. So if we wanted to say hello plus there, right? It would end up saying hello there, okay? It would actually push both of those together, okay? There wouldn't actually be a space here because a space is an additional character, okay? So spaces are actually character within strings at this point. So if we wanted to have hello and there be including a space, we would need to actually set up a space here, okay? The other thing to note is if we try to do this plus 22, again, it would infer that it wants to utilize this type, data type, and try and coerce this data type to a string. So that you would end up with hello 22, okay? Oh, good point. Okay, so it'd probably end up like that. Okay. Good point. Let's double check. Oops, wrong one. There we go. Yeah, no spaces. Okay. We already talked about. We already know arithmetic operators like addition, subtraction. We have multiplication, division. Does anybody know what this one is? Modulo, right? Okay, and that's really taking the remainder of two given integers. How many times can something end up in another thing, right? What are the remainder pieces of that? Okay, we already talked about and or, and then the other one is not, right? So nothing. Nothing equals not something. Okay. And not would toggle true and false. Okay. Okay. So when we talked about this here, right, when I started writing function, it was like, oh, function is, there we go. There's multiple ways that we can create like functions. We can say var my function equals function. Okay, or we can basically create a variable for it. Okay, this is creating a function. This is not invoking that function, right? So in order for me to actually use this function, I would have to actually invoke it. So like basically it's like speaking it out loud, right? So then if I wanted to use my function, I would say my function, and then that would actually be invoking it, calling it to happen. And then we talked about these two parentheses. It's basically, these are called parameters. So we're setting parameters that are required for this argument. So technically, if I wanted my function to run, I would need to put something in here, right? Because otherwise, we would get an error saying you did not provide the argument that's required or set here in order for this function to run. It takes an argument. Additionally, you can have multiple arguments, right, set up in a function. And then last, with ES6, etc., you can set a default argument. So then within here, if I don't already call something, I can say default. Okay. Okay, so this will it will automatically run this plus 5, even if I didn't put an argument in here. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. I think that's it for JavaScript fundamentally stuff. Okay. When you're doing your work, we are really keeping in mind the syntax. So please do make sure your arguments are really next to your functions, that you put a space between the parameters and the block, that you're tabbing in 2 spaces, or the tab in the work that you're doing. And then if you're doing something like that, that's also tabbed in. Okay. If you're doing else, if here, that it goes inside of that. Okay, and that you're keeping in mind where things end. Okay, so that syntax is really important. Can't say else and else and else. Okay, so that syntax is really important. Again, we already know making comments is like that. Do y'all have any questions about anything in JavaScript so far that we already kind of feel like y'all have done a good amount of this so far? Cool. And we'll get more into, like, as we go along, we're going to get into a much deeper understanding of JavaScript, to a place where you're going to find this very, very elementary. But for now, make sure you're focused and understand how each of these pieces work. Yeah. Okay. All right, so now that we've done this, we're going to